No one noticed her at first. She wore the same faded jacket every morning, sleeves rolled too far up, hands always busy. In a refugee clinic near the border, dozens of volunteers came and went, but she stayed. Quiet, observant, uncomplaining. Her name was Elena Moore, and on paper she was nothing more than a civilian volunteer. No rank, no weapon, no official duty beyond bandages and clean water. The war had eaten the country slowly. Villages burned without headlines. Roads vanished under shell craters. And still, Elena showed up every dawn, stepping over broken glass and empty casings like they were part of the landscape. She had arrived 6 months earlier with a humanitarian convoy. When the rest rotated out, she stayed behind. Why? One medic asked her once. She didn't answer. She rarely did. Elena worked where others hesitated. She cleaned wounds that smelled of rot. She held hands when painkillers ran out. She learned which screams meant fear and which meant death approaching. At night, when artillery thundered like an angry god, she sat outside the tents and wrote letters for the injured soldiers who couldn't move their hands. Letters to mothers. Letters to wives. Letters to children who still believed their fathers were invincible. She never signed her name, but she remembered every word. What no one knew, not even the officers who passed through the clinic, was that Elena had grown up in a military family. Her father died overseas when she was 10. Her mother never recovered. Elena learned early that war didn't need permission to take everything. She didn't hate the war. She hated what had erased point one evening. A patrol staggered into the clinic under fire. The lead soldier collapsed before the entrance, blood soaking through his uniform. The medic froze. The nurse screamed for morphine that didn't exist. Elena moved. She knelt in the dirt, pressed her hands into the wound, and spoke calmly, counting breaths, controlling bleeding, issuing commands like someone who had done this before. The soldier lived. That an officer watched her that night. 2 days later, another patrol arrived, this time ambushed, radios destroyed. Elena coordinated triage without waiting for orders. She mapped injuries, prioritized evacuation, and saved 3 men who should have died. The officer asked her again, "Who trained you?" She looked up, eyes tired but steady. "My father." The officer nodded slowly. From that moment, Elena was no longer invisible. Words spread quietly. Not officially, just murmured between units passing through the area. The volunteer knows combat medicine. The volunteer doesn't panic. The volunteer stays when shells fall. Then came the night the clinic was hit. Mortars fell without warning. The first explosion tore through the supply tent. The second collapsed the entrance. Screams filled the air. Fire spread. Chaos ruled. Elena dragged the wounded out one by one until shrapnel cut her leg open. She wrapped it with her own scarf and kept moving. When the enemy breached the perimeter, there were no soldiers left standing. Only volunteers and injured men. Elena picked up a rifle from the ground. She had never fired one in combat. She didn't hesitate. She positioned herself at the narrow pass, buying time. Every second mattered. Every breath burned. She fired until the rifle clicked empty, then dragged another wounded man behind cover. Reinforcements arrived an hour later. The clinic was gone. Elena survived. 3 weeks later, far from the front, a mother opened a letter written in careful handwriting. It described how her son had died bravely. At the bottom was a name she didn't recognize. Elena Moore. In another city. Another family read the same name. Then another, and another. The war letters traveled where Elena never could, and people began to ask, "Who is she?" Part 2. The name appeared first in whispers, then in conversations, then in official reports that tried and failed to explain why a civilian volunteer kept being mentioned in after-action summaries. Elena Moore assisted with evacuation. Elena Moore stabilized critical casualties. Elena Moore remained under fire. The military didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't enlisted. She refused formal rank. She rejected offers to leave. When asked why she stayed, she answered simply, "Someone has to remember." As the war dragged on, Elena moved with the front lines. Clinics, shelters, ruins. Wherever people broke, she appeared. Soldiers began asking for her by name. Not for treatment, but for letters. If I don't make it, they said, will you write for me? She always said yes. She memorized their faces, their voices, their last jokes. One winter morning, a young lieutenant handed her a sealed envelope. Don't open it unless I die, he said, trying to smile. He died that afternoon. Elena opened the letter by firelight, tears freezing on her lashes, and rewrote it in her own words so the mother wouldn't carry guilt forever. Weeks later, the enemy launched a final offensive near the border town. Evacuation orders were issued. Civilians first. Elena refused. I'm staying, she said. For what? An officer demanded. She looked at the wounded men who couldn't move. For them. The town fell. For 3 days, no contact came out. Command assumed everyone left behind was dead. Then a convoy broke through. They found Elena alive, exhausted, wounded, still working. 12 men survived because she never left. When the war finally ended, the headlines named generals and victories. But in quiet homes, families read letters written in familiar handwriting. And they remembered her. Years later, a memorial wall was built. Thousands of names carved in stone. Soldiers, medics, civilians. Among them was one name that didn't belong to a rank. Elena Moore. Volunteer people stopped there the longest, because she was just a volunteer, until her name appeared in the war letters. The war did not end with silence. It ended with exhaustion. When the ceasefire was announced, people expected cheering. Instead, there was confusion. Men staring at the ground, women afraid to move, cities unsure whether to breathe again. Elena Moore stood in the remains of what had once been a school gymnasium turned field hospital, listening to the distant echo of guns finally fading into memory. The rubble smelled of smoke, dust, and lives once lived, reminders of a world that no longer existed. She didn't celebrate. She packed bandages, because even when wars stop, wounds don't. Soldiers were discharged and sent home with medals and nightmares. Civilians returned to houses without roofs, to streets where names no longer matched the doors. And Elena stayed where she always had, between those who survived and those who would never forget how close they came to dying. Command offered her extraction, papers, recognition, a quiet life somewhere safe, far from sirens and blood. She refused all of it. I'm not finished, she said. It didn't understand what she meant, but the letters did. The war letters had spread farther than any official report. Mothers compared handwriting across cities that once hated each other. Wives recognized phrasing, the gentle pauses between lines. Fathers noticed how carefully the truth was told. Never cruel, never cold. Always human. Always Elena. Journalists tried to find her. They failed. She changed locations often, slept where there was space, disappeared before cameras arrived. When one reporter finally cornered her outside a temporary shelter and asked why she risked her life for people who weren't hers, Elena paused for a long time. Then she answered quietly, "They become mine when they're dying." That sentence never made it to print. Months passed. Borders reopened. Aid organizations rotated out. The world moved forward with a strange urgency, as if speed could erase memory. Elena didn't. She helped exhume mass graves. She sat with families identifying belongings instead of bodies. Rings, watches, torn photographs. She learned how to say, "I'm sorry," in 5 languages and meant it every time. Some nights, she woke up reaching for people who were no longer there, whispering names that only she remembered, names that would never appear in headlines. She walked through empty streets at dawn, collecting fragments of life and laughter, imagining the world that could have been. One afternoon, a young soldier approached her, barely older than 18. His uniform still smelled new, but his eyes didn't. He held a folded letter with shaking hands. "You wrote to my mother," he said. Elena looked up slowly. She said it felt like you knew me." She nodded. "I did." The soldier swallowed hard, fighting tears he wasn't trained to show. "She wants to meet you." Elena had never agreed to that before. Meeting families meant reopening doors she worked hard to keep closed. But something in his eyes, something broken yet hopeful, made her say yes. The meeting happened in a small house far from the front. surrounded by quiet fields that had never heard gunfire. The mother hugged Elena without speaking. They cried together, not loudly but honestly. No words were needed. When it was over, the woman pressed something into Elena's hand, a stack of letters. "Others sent these," she said. "They thought you should have them. They said you carried their voices. Now I want to carry yours." That night, Elena read until dawn. Letters thanking her, letters forgiving her, letters from children who grew up knowing their fathers through her words, letters saying that because of her, grief felt lighter, even survivable. Some letters didn't thank her at all. They simply said, "I remember." And that was enough. For the first time since the war began, Elena allowed herself to sit still. She realized then that she had carried everyone else's pain for so long. She had forgotten she was allowed to rest, allowed to heal. Months turned into years. The rubble was cleared, roads rebuilt, cities claimed their names back. Yet Elena remained, a quiet, steady presence wherever stories needed to be told. She began visiting schools, teaching children not about battles or medals, but about courage, compassion, and the humanity that war tried to erase. She spoke of responsibility, not just to survive, but to remember, to care, and to speak truth in a world eager to forget. Years later, schools taught about the conflict in dates and numbers, strategies, treaties, maps with arrows and lines showing advances and retreats. But in homes, stories were told differently. They spoke of a woman who showed up when everything else failed, that a woman who stayed when leaving was easier, that a woman who listened when no one else could, that a woman whose name carried truth instead of rank, that a woman whose courage was quiet yet undeniable, whose legacy was stitched into letters, photographs, and memories. When the memorial wall was expanded, veterans requested one addition. No title, no medal, just a name. Elena Moore, volunteer. She stood before it on a quiet morning, older now, hair touched with gray, walking with a slight limp that never fully healed. She traced the letters once, then stepped back. Around her, families stood silently, some crying, some smiling through tears, people she had never met, yet somehow always known. She didn't cry, because she knew something the stone never could. She had already lived forever. In every letter that made it home, in every tear she had soothed, in every life she had quietly saved. And as the wind blew across the memorial, carrying whispers of gratitude from thousands who owed her survival to her courage, she smiled slightly, knowing that her fight had never truly ended. It had simply changed form. Elena Moore, a volunteer, was more than a name now. She was a story, a memory, a quiet force that would never fade.